Stay away from my house. Just send the money, she warned me over the phone, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. So I sent the envelope exactly like she asked. What she found inside made her drop to her knees on her own front porch, and by the time she called me back, she couldn't even speak. Hi everyone, before I go on, if this is your first time here, welcome. I'm so glad you found me. If you've been with me a while, you already know I tell it straight, no sugarcoating. Please hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. It truly helps an old woman like me keep sharing these stories with you. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching this from tonight? I love scrolling through and seeing all the different places you all tune in from. Now let me tell you what happened to me this spring because I still get a little shaky thinking about it. My name is Judy. I'm 72 years old, and I've lived in the same house for 44 years. My husband and I raised our son David in that house. We buried my husband from that house 6 years ago. It's the only place I've ever really called home, and I want you to remember that detail because it matters later. David is a good boy. Was a good boy, I should say, though he's 50 now, so I suppose I ought to stop calling him a boy. He married a woman named Kimberly about 8 years ago. I really did try, to love her the way I loved my son. In the beginning she was polite enough. She'd bring a bottle of wine to Sunday dinner. She'd compliment my roast, she'd ask about my garden. But something shifted after the wedding. Slowly at first, the way a tide goes out so gradual you don't notice the shore is empty until you're standing in mud. It started small. She stopped coming to Sunday dinners, said she was tired from work. Then David stopped coming too. Said he didn't want to leave her home alone. Then the visits became once a month, then once every few months, until finally I was seeing my only son maybe 4 times a year. And always with that tight, nervous look on his face like he was watching a clock that only he could see. I found out later that Kimberly had a rule. She never came right out and said it to my face, she was too smart for that. But David let it slip one Christmas after too much eggnog. She didn't want me having what she called too much influence over their household. She didn't want me giving advice about the kids, didn't want me stopping by unannounced, didn't want me close. I remember sitting in my kitchen that Christmas night after they left, just staring at the wall, trying to understand what I had done to deserve being erased from my own son's life. I have 2 grandchildren, by the way. Ella, who's 11 now, and Sam, who's 8. I love those children more than I love my own life. And that's not an exaggeration for the camera, that's the plain truth. But I was only allowed to see them a handful of times a year, always on Kimberly's terms, always with her standing in the doorway watching me like I might slip something dangerous into their pockets. Now here's where the story really starts. About 4 months ago, David called me, and I could hear right away something was wrong. His voice was thin, stretched out like a wire about to snap. He told me they were in trouble. Not the kind of trouble you fix with a little patience, the kind of trouble that comes with a certified letter and a deadline. Kimberly had co-signed a loan for her sister's failed business a few years back, something I never even knew about, and the sister had defaulted. Now the bank was coming after Kimberly and David both, and they were staring down the possibility of losing their house in 6 weeks if they couldn't come up with a lump sum. I didn't hesitate. I told David I would help however I could. I have some savings, not a fortune, but enough that I've been careful with my whole life. Money my husband and I put away a little at a time for 40 years. I told David I'd need a few days to move some things around, talk to my bank, and I'd have an answer for him. That's when Kimberly got on the phone. I want you to understand, this woman had barely spoken more than a few polite sentences to me in years. But the moment she smelled money, she found her voice real quick. She told me, and I remember every word because I wrote it down the second I hung up. She said, "Judy, I appreciate it, but let's be clear about something. This is our house, our business, not yours. You send the money and that's it. Stay away from my house, don't come over, don't ask questions, don't try to insert yourself into how we run things afterward. Just send the money." I sat there holding that phone for a long moment. 72 years old, and I still felt like a scolded child. But underneath the sting, something else was rising up in me. Something I hadn't felt in years. Call it clarity. Call it the last bit of backbone an old woman has left after a lifetime of being told to make herself smaller. I told her I understood. I told her I'd send it. Now before I go on, let me ask you something and be honest in the comments. If someone who had shut you out of your grandchildren's lives for years suddenly needed your money, would you just hand it over quiet as a mouse? Or would you do what I did? I spent the next week thinking. Not about whether to help, My mind was made up on that the moment David told me they were scared. This wasn't about punishing my son. This was never about David. This was about a woman who had spent 8 years treating me like an inconvenience, and now expected me to hand over my life savings and disappear back into my corner like a good little mother-in-law. So I made a decision. I would send the money. Every dollar they needed, I would send it because I love my son and I love those grandbabies more than my own pride. But I was not going to send it the way she wanted. I was not going to be invisible about it. I went to my bank and I withdrew a cashier's check for the full amount, $38,000. That was nearly everything I had set aside beyond my funeral fund, and I want to be honest with you, my hands were shaking when the teller handed it to me. But I also went to a print shop, and I had them help me put together something else. I brought old photographs, 40 years of them, pictures of David as a baby in my arms, pictures of him graduating high school, pictures of his wedding day, back when Kimberly still smiled at me like I mattered. And I brought pictures I'd been collecting quietly for years without her knowing, moments David had sent me secretly on his phone, birthday parties I wasn't invited to, Ella's dance recitals, Sam's first day of school, pictures David would send me late at night saying don't tell her I sent these, she doesn't like when I do this. I had all of it printed onto a long photo collage, framed nicely, along with a letter. I wrote that letter over 3 days, tearing up more drafts than I care to admit. In it, I told her the truth. I told her that I knew exactly how she felt about me, that I'd known for years, that I'd swallowed every slight in silence because I loved my son too much to make him choose between us. I told her that I was sending the money not because she demanded it, but because I chose to, out of love for my grandchildren, a love she had tried to ration out to me like it was hers to control. And I told her something else. I told her that money isn't the only thing a family can run out of. Patience runs out. Silence runs out. And forgiveness, if you spend enough of somebody's dignity, that runs out too. I put the cashier's check in the envelope along with that letter and the photo collage, and I mailed it certified so I'd know the exact moment it arrived. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. I know because David called me 40 minutes later and he was crying. Not sad crying. He told me Kimberly had opened the envelope on the porch, expecting just a check, and instead found her entire marriage laid out in photographs she didn't know existed, alongside a letter that named every single thing she'd done. He said she sat down right there on the porch steps and didn't move for almost 20 minutes. When he came outside to check on her, she couldn't even form a sentence. She just handed him the letter and pointed at the photographs, tears running down her face, completely speechless. David told me later that something broke open in her that day, but not in a bad way. He said it was like she'd been carrying around this idea of herself as the one in control, the one setting the rules for the whole family, and suddenly she was looking at proof in her own husband's handwriting basically, of years of a mother who loved from a distance because she wasn't allowed any closer. He said she cried for 2 days. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you this fixed everything overnight because that wouldn't be honest, and I promised you all a long time ago that I would always be honest with you. Real families don't heal in one dramatic afternoon just because a letter got read. Took weeks. Kimberly called me herself about 10 days later, and her voice was different, smaller somehow, not weak, just softer than I'd ever heard it. She apologized. She told me she'd built up a wall because of her own mother, who she said had been overbearing and controlling when she was raising her own kids, and Kimberly had promised herself she'd never let a mother-in-law have that kind of power over her family. She said she looked at me and saw a threat instead of a woman who just wanted to hold her grandchildren a little more often. I told her I understood fear. I told her I'd been afraid too, afraid of losing David completely if I ever pushed back, so I'd stayed quiet instead, and quiet doesn't fix anything, it just lets the wound fester longer. We talked for almost 2 hours that day. It wasn't an easy conversation. There were long pauses, some tears on both ends of the line, and a few moments where old resentment tried to creep back in. But by the end of it, something had shifted between us that hadn't shifted in 8 years. The loan situation got resolved. My money helped save their house, and I want to be clear, I never once brought that up as leverage, not during that call, not after. I gave that money freely the way a mother gives without keeping score. But I do believe that envelope, and everything inside it, cracked open a door that had been welded shut for years. 3 weeks ago, Kimberly called and invited me to Sunday dinner. Not the stiff, watch clock kind of dinner I used to get a few times a year. She asked me to come early and help her in the kitchen, The way a daughter-in-law might ask a mother-in-law she actually trusts. Ella sat next to me the whole meal and showed me her sketchbook. Sam climbed into my lap after dessert, something he hadn't done since he was a toddler, and fell asleep there while the adults talked. Before I left that night, Kimberly walked me out to my car and she hugged me. A real hug, not the quick side pat she used to give at the door. She told me she was sorry it took something so painful to get here. I told her I was sorry too, sorry it took me so long to finally speak up instead of staying quiet all those years just to keep the peace. I still get emotional telling you all this. 72 years old, and I learned something I wish I'd learned decades ago. Love without honesty just turns into distance dressed up as politeness. I loved my son's family quietly for 8 years, and all that quiet did was let a wall get built brick by brick until I was standing on the outside of my own family looking in. Sending that envelope wasn't about revenge, not really, even though I know some of you are going to call it that in the comments and maybe you're a little bit right. But it wasn't about hurting Kimberly. It was about refusing to disappear. It was about saying you can set boundaries in your home, that's your right, but you cannot erase 44 years of love and call it protecting your family. Real protection doesn't require cutting a grandmother out of her grandchildren's lives. These days I see Ella and Sam almost every week. Kimberly calls me sometimes just to talk, not because she needs something, just to talk, the way I always hoped a daughter-in-law might. David tells me he's never seen his wife and his mother get along this well, and every time he says it, I feel my whole chest loosen a little, like I've been holding my breath for 8 years and finally get to let it out. I share this story with you all not to brag about how it ended, because plenty of families go through something similar, and it doesn't end so gently. I share it because I know so many of you out there are the quiet ones too, the mothers and grandmothers who swallow hurt to keep from rocking the boat. I want you to know that speaking your truth, even when your hands are shaking while you do it, even when you're scared of what it might cost you, that's not selfish. That's not causing trouble. That is exactly what it means to finally love yourself as much as you've always loved everyone else. If this story moved you even a little, please give it a like, and if you haven't subscribed yet, I would be so grateful if you did. It helps me keep coming back here to share these moments with you. And I'd love to know down in the comments, have you ever had to send your own kind of envelope? A hard truth, a boundary, something you've been too afraid to say out loud for years? Tell me your story. I read every single comment, and I promise you, whatever you've been carrying, you are not alone in it. Thank you all so much for sitting with me tonight. I'll see you in the next one, and until then, be gentle with yourselves, but don't be silent. Silence never protected anybody. Take care, everybody.